The night the shelter turned them away for the third time, Caleb Hartley counted the money in his jacket pocket by streetlight. $9, 3 brothers, 1 blanket, and a bus bench that had already been claimed by someone else. Nobody in that town would have guessed that 6 weeks later, the Hartley brothers would own a piece of the coastline. 200 miles up the shore stood a lighthouse the county had stopped maintaining before any of them were born. Paint peeling to bare iron. Windows boarded with plywood gone soft at the edges. The kind of place a map still remembered, and the world had quietly forgotten. Sitting on land nobody wanted enough to pay the back taxes on it. A great-uncle none of them had ever met had held the deed for decades. Alone, saying nothing to a family that had long since stopped asking about him. When the county clerk read the number out loud, $6, it sounded less like a sale and more like a door left unlocked on purpose. At the top of the tower, past a spiral stair no one had climbed in years, a service room had been sealed behind brick and silence. Whatever waited inside it had outlasted the man who put it there, and it was about to answer questions 3 brothers didn't yet know they were carrying. This is the story of an abandoned lighthouse, a debt $6 wide, and an inheritance that had been waiting in the dark far longer than any of them had been alive. Caleb Hartley had grown up believing a man was only as good as his last full day of work. That was his father's line, said over a coffee can full of nails and a radio tuned to the weather station back when the Hartley name still meant something in Marsh Fork. Wendell Hartley had framed half the houses on County Road 11 with his own 2 hands, a Milwaukee circular saw that never left his truck bed, and a level he trusted more than most men's word. He raised 3 sons on that philosophy and very little else, and for a while, it had been enough. But to understand how 3 brothers ended up counting $9 under a streetlight, it helps to go back to the year the framing work dried up, and the Hartley house went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with peace. Wendell died on a Tuesday in March, his heart giving out on a ladder 6 feet off the ground, and the fall did more damage to the family than the heart attack itself. Caleb was 20 then, the oldest, already working odd carpentry jobs for cash. His brothers, Danny and Theo, were 18 and 17, still finishing out a school year that suddenly felt like a formality. There was no life insurance to speak of. There was a mortgage 2 payments behind and a truck with a cracked block. Their mother had been gone 11 years by then, and nobody in Marsh Fork was under any illusion that 3 boys and a dead man's tools were going to hold a household together on their own. For the first several months they tried. Caleb picked up whatever framing and roofing work came through, paid in cash or not paid at all, depending on the contractor. Danny dropped out to work the counter at a feed store for $9 an hour, and Theo, the youngest, kept going to school because Caleb made him, walking 2 miles each way when the truck wouldn't start. They ate a lot of rice and canned beans that year. They learned which grocery stores marked down bread after 8 in the evening, and which gas station let you fill a 5-gallon can on credit if you knew the owner. It was hard, but it was theirs. And for a while, that distinction mattered more than the hunger did. The bank took the house in November, 14 months after Wendell's funeral. The letter came typed and folded into thirds, the kind of document that could end a family history in 4 paragraphs and a signature line. Caleb remembered standing in the kitchen reading it twice, then a third time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something survivable. They had 90 days. 90 days turned into moving what fit into the truck bed and selling what didn't, including Wendell's Milwaukee saw, which brought in $60 from a man 2 towns over who didn't know or care what it had built. Caleb kept the level. He never explained why, and nobody asked. They tried an apartment first, the 3 of them splitting a 2-bedroom unit above a laundromat in Pinnacle, 40 minutes from Marsh Fork, because 40 minutes felt far enough to start over and close enough to still call it home. Danny kept the feed store job by driving the 40 minutes back each morning until the truck's transmission finally quit for good on a Sunday in February. stranded on the shoulder of Route 9 with steam rising off the hood. After that, the jobs became harder to reach, and the rent became harder to make. And the landlord, a quiet man named Purcell, who had liked their father, gave them 2 extra months before he had no choice but to file the paperwork. He apologized when he did it. Caleb told him there was nothing to apologize for, and meant it, though it took effort to say. What followed was a year that none of the brothers spoke about easily even later, once things had changed. They stayed with an aunt in Charleston for 6 weeks until her lease made that impossible. They slept in the truck before the truck was gone, parked behind a church that didn't ask questions. Theo, 16 going on 17 through all of it, kept a paperback novel in his coat pocket and read it under gas station lighting because it was one of the only things that still felt like his. Danny picked up day labor wherever a crew foreman was willing to overlook that he had no fixed address and no phone that reliably held a charge. Caleb took whatever carpentry came his way, cash only, and kept a running tally in a notebook of what they owed each other and what they didn't, though none of them ever asked to be paid back. They learned the unglamorous mechanics of having nothing. Which laundromat let you sit inside past closing if you bought a soda from the machine? Which fast food counter would let 3 brothers split a $5 meal and linger at a booth for 2 hours out of the cold? Which shelters had beds and which had waiting lists longer than the winter itself? Caleb kept his father's level wrapped in a shop rag at the bottom of his duffel bag through all of it, through Charleston and the church parking lot and the shelter intake forms that asked for an address he no longer had. He never used it for work in that stretch. There was no work steady enough to need it. He kept it the way some men keep a photograph, because it was proof that something had once been built and built well, even if nothing around them looked like it now. By the time the calendar turned to a new year, the Hartley brothers had been without a fixed roof for 11 months, moving between a widening circle of shelters, church basements, and the occasional couch offered by someone who remembered their father fondly and could only help for a night or two. 20 years old, Caleb had learned to read a shelter intake worker's face before she finished a sentence, learned which tone of voice meant there was a bed and which meant there wasn't. Danny had learned to swallow pride at a rate that would have surprised him 2 years earlier. Theo had stopped mentioning the paperback and started mentioning college, quietly, almost as an apology, as though wanting something more than survival had become an embarrassment. It was not, by any of their reckonings, a story that seemed headed anywhere in particular. There was no reason to believe the next month would look different from the last 11, and every reason to believe it might look worse. What none of the 3 brothers knew, standing in line outside a shelter with a capacity sign and a clipboard, was that a man they had never met, a great-uncle their father had rarely spoken of, had spent the last 40 years of his life keeping a promise on a strip of coastline none of them had ever seen. That promise and the $6 debt attached to it was already sitting in a county filing cabinet 200 miles away, waiting for someone to come looking. The letter arrived at the shelter on a Thursday, addressed to Caleb Hartley, care of a forwarding service he had set up 8 months earlier out of habit more than hope. It came from the office of a probate attorney in a county he had never heard of, on stationery thick enough to feel expensive between 2 fingers. Caleb read it standing at the intake desk while a volunteer waited for him to sign in, and he had to read the second paragraph twice before the words settled into something he could believe. A man named Elias Hartley, listed as his late father's uncle, had died in January at the age of 87, and the estate, such as it was, named Wendell Hartley's sons as heirs. There was no mention of money in the letter, no figure that might have explained why an 87-year-old stranger's death would matter to 3 brothers sleeping 4 to a room in a converted church annex. What the letter did contain was an address for the county courthouse in a place called Hollis Bay, a case number, and a request that the heirs appear in person or send a representative within 60 days to settle the matter of an outstanding tax lien on a piece of real property. Caleb showed the letter to Danny and Theo that night, passing it hand to hand under the flickering fluorescent light of the annex kitchen, and none of them said much. Theo asked if Elias Hartley was the same uncle their father used to mention at Thanksgiving, the one who moved away before any of them were born. Caleb said he didn't know. He had never met the man, and neither had Danny, and Wendell had spoken of him maybe 3 or 4 times in 20 years, always briefly, always in a tone that closed the subject rather than opened it. Getting to Hollis Bay took 4 days of saving bus fare and one favor from Purcell, their old landlord, who still had a soft spot for the family, and drove them the last 40 miles himself without being asked twice. The courthouse sat on the town square like it had been poured from the same gray concrete as the sidewalk, a building built to outlast its purpose and mostly succeeding. Caleb went in alone while his brothers waited outside on a bench, Danny picking at a hole in his jacket sleeve, Theo reading the same paperback he'd been carrying for over a year now, its spine cracked in 6 places. Inside, the air smelled like old paper and radiator heat, and a clerk named Marjorie Pruitt looked at Caleb's forwarded letter for a long moment before pulling a thick folder from a drawer marked with a case number written in pencil. The folder told a story in the flat, bureaucratic language that county offices specialize in. Elias Hartley had owned a parcel of land on the coast, deeded to him in 1981, containing a decommissioned lighthouse structure and an adjoining keeper's cottage, both listed as condemned by the county in 2006. Property taxes had gone unpaid for the last 3 years of his life, not because the amounts were large, but because, as Marjorie explained without looking up from the file, an old man living alone sometimes simply stopped opening his mail. The accumulated lien came to $211. Caleb stared at the number twice, certain he had misread it, before Marjorie confirmed it in the same flat tone she might have used to read out the weather. $211 stood between the Hartley brothers and a piece of land that, on paper, had a keeper's cottage and a 104-foot tower attached to it. There was, Marjorie explained, a wrinkle. The county had scheduled the parcel for a tax lien auction in 6 weeks' time, open to any bidder, heirs included, and if the Hartleys wanted the property, they would need to either pay the lien outright or win the auction, whichever came first and cost less. Nobody expected outside bidders. A condemned lighthouse 2 hours from the nearest town with a grocery store larger than a corner market was not, Marjorie said with something close to a smile, what most investors were circling that season. Caleb asked what would happen if nobody bid at all. Marjorie told him the county would simply carry the debt forward another cycle, and the property would sit as it had sat for years, boarded and forgotten, until somebody, anybody, decided it was worth the trouble. He asked to see whatever records existed on Elias Hartley beyond the tax file, and Marjorie, who by then had softened toward the quiet, tired young man in front of her, pulled a second, thinner folder. It held little. A property deed. A single photograph, black and white, curling at the corners, showing a much younger Elias standing at the base of the lighthouse in what looked like a Coast Guard uniform, squinting into weather. A note, handwritten and yellowed, paper-clipped to the inside cover, reading only that the keeper's cottage utilities had been shut off in 2009 at the owner's request, though the owner had continued visiting the property on a regular basis, according to a neighbor's complaint filed the same year. Caleb read that line 3 times. A man who had shut off his own water and electricity had kept coming back anyway, for reasons nobody in that file had bothered to record. He carried the photograph out to the bench where his brothers waited, and the 3 of them passed it between them the way they had passed the letter days before, saying little. Danny asked if the man in the photograph looked like their father. Theo said he looked like nobody in particular, just a man standing very straight in front of a very tall building. Caleb turned the photograph over and found nothing written on the back. No date, no note, nothing but the faint impression of where an old rubber band had once held it to something else. Now lost. It struck him, sitting there on the courthouse bench with $211 standing between them and an inheritance none of them understood. that they knew almost nothing about the man who had left it to them, and that whatever answer existed was 2 hours up the coast, sealed inside a building that hadn't been opened in years. They did not have $211, not all at once, not without selling something none of them had left to sell. But they had 6 weeks, and an auction that nobody else seemed likely to attend, and a bus schedule that could get them within 20 miles of Hollis Bay if they timed it right. Caleb folded the photograph carefully into the same jacket pocket where he still carried his father's tape measure. The one thing besides the level that had survived every move, every shelter, every cold night in the church parking lot. Danny asked what came next. Caleb said the only thing he could think to say, which was that they were going to go. Look at it, all 3 of them, before they decided anything. Theo closed his paperback and stood up first. The bus dropped them at a gas station outside Hollis Bay on a Saturday morning, 20 miles short of where they needed to be. With $6 between the 3 of them and a folded county map Marjorie Pruitt had photocopied and pressed into Caleb's hand on his way out the courthouse door. She had drawn a small circle around a place labeled Gull Point and written, in neat cursive, that the last 2 miles weren't marked on any map worth trusting. Caleb thanked her without fully understanding what she meant. He understood it better 3 hours later, standing at the edge of a parking lot with his brothers, watching the gas station attendant point down a road that didn't look like it led anywhere in particular. They walked the first 4 miles because there was nothing else to do with the $6 but save it, and because none of them wanted to spend the last of their cash on a taxi that might not even make the final stretch. The highway was easy walking, a shoulder wide enough for the 3 of them to move single file when a truck passed. Gulls circling overhead in numbers that grew steadily the closer they got to the water. Danny counted mile markers out loud for a while, a habit from childhood road trips that none of them had the heart to tell him to stop. Theo kept his paperback in his coat pocket the whole way, untouched, eyes on the horizon instead, where a thin gray line of ocean had started to show itself past the tree line. The pavement gave out first, the highway narrowing into a county road marked only by a faded green sign reading Route 9. The asphalt patched so many times it looked more like a quilt than a road. Houses grew sparse, then stopped altogether, replaced by scrub pine and the kind of marsh grass that meant the water was close, even before you could smell the salt. A man in a pickup slowed alongside them at one point, asked where 3 young men on foot thought they were headed. And when Caleb told him, Gull Point, the man raised his eyebrows, said there was nothing out that way but an old light station nobody had touched in years, and offered them a ride the rest of the distance without being asked twice. His name was Dale, and he ran a bait and tackle stand near the harbor, and he talked the whole way about tides and rockfish and how the county kept promising to tear the old tower down and never got around to it. The county road gave out too, eventually, narrowing into a gravel track that rattled the pickup's frame and threw up a fine white dust that coated the windshield. Dale slowed the truck to a crawl, apologizing for the ride as the gravel gave way to hard-packed dirt rutted deep from spring rain, scrub brush closing in on both sides until it scraped the truck's mirrors. Caleb watched the world narrow through the windshield, the wide sky of the highway shrinking down to a single dirt lane barely wide enough for one vehicle. Trees leaning in overhead like the land itself was trying to seal the road back up behind them. Dale said this was as far as his truck would go without risking the oil pan, and let them out at a rusted chain-link gate hanging half off its hinges, one panel folded back like it had been pried open by hand years ago and never fixed. Beyond the gate, the dirt track continued another quarter-mile on foot, through beach grass tall enough to brush against their knees, the smell of salt and rot and low tide growing stronger with every step. Caleb walked in front, the photograph of Elias Hartley still folded in his jacket pocket alongside his father's tape measure, and he found himself glancing at it again without meaning to, comparing the young man in Coast Guard whites to the tower that was slowly coming into view above the tree line. It rose higher than he expected, 104 feet by the county's own file, its white paint gone gray and peeling in long vertical strips. Black iron railings crusted orange with rust. The keeper's cottage stood beside it, single story. Windows boarded with plywood gone soft and swollen from decades of weather. A chimney leaning at an angle that suggested it hadn't drawn smoke in a very long time. Danny stopped walking first, staring up at the tower with an expression Caleb hadn't seen on his brother's face in over a year, something closer to wonder than exhaustion. Theo said it looked bigger than the photograph in the county file, and Caleb agreed, though neither of them could explain why that mattered. The whole property had the particular stillness of a place that had been abandoned long enough for nature to start reclaiming it in earnest. Vines working their way up the cottage's north wall, a fallen section of fence rusted into the sand, gulls nesting in gaps along the tower's iron gallery where the railing had come loose. It looked, in every sense that counted, exactly like what the county records had described. Condemned. Forgotten. Worth exactly $211 to anyone willing to pay it. Except for one thing, and it was Theo who noticed it first, tugging on Caleb's sleeve and pointing toward the lantern room at the very top of the tower. Every pane of glass up there was clouded with salt film and grime, the accumulated haze of years without a hand to wipe it clean. Every pane except one on the seaward side, which caught the afternoon light in a hard, clean flash. Glass so clear, it looked freshly washed. Caleb stood there a long moment, squinting up at it, trying to make the detail fit with everything else he was looking at, and failing. Danny asked if it was just a trick of the light. Caleb said he didn't think so, and he found he couldn't stop looking at it, that single clean pane catching the sun like a wink from somewhere far above them, in a building that had supposedly stood empty since before any of them were born. They walked the rest of the way to the base of the tower in silence, none of them saying what they were all clearly thinking, that a place this abandoned had no business having one clear window at the top of it. The cottage door hung open a few inches on a broken hinge, and beyond it Caleb could see the shape of an iron door built into the tower's base, heavy and windowless, sealed with a wheel lock mechanism gone orange with rust, more like something off a ship than a building. He set his duffel bag down in the sand, flexed his hands once, and looked back at his brothers. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing left to say that the tower itself, waiting there in the late afternoon light with its one impossible clean window, hadn't already said for them. Caleb spent the first 20 minutes just walking the perimeter of the tower, hands in his pockets, doing the thing his father had taught him to do before touching any job site, which was to look at the whole of it before touching any part of it. The base of the lighthouse was built from granite block, mortar joints crumbling in places but the stone itself sound, and the iron door was set into a shallow archway on the leeward side, sheltered from the worst of the weather by the keeper's cottage standing just beside it. The wheel lock mechanism at its center was the kind of thing Caleb had only seen in photographs of old ships, a spoked iron wheel meant to be turned by hand, seized now under decades of rust, the color of dried blood. Danny crouched down next to it and ran a thumb along one spoke, and a fine orange dust came away on his skin like the metal itself was dissolving. They did not have proper tools, not at first, and Caleb refused to force anything without them, a stubbornness his brothers recognized from watching their father refuse to cut a board before he'd measured it twice. Dale, the bait shop owner, true to the kind of man who offers a ride to strangers without being asked, had mentioned before dropping them off that his cousin ran a small hardware supply out of a converted garage 2 miles back down Route 9, and that he kept odd hours and an even odder inventory. Caleb walked the 2 miles alone while his brothers stayed behind, and he came back an hour later with a can of penetrating oil, a 3-pound hand sledge, and a 4-foot pry bar with a curved claw end, all of it charged to an account the cousin, a heavy-set man named Wilkes, opened for him on nothing but a handshake and Caleb's promise to settle up once they had 2 nickels to rub together. The oil went first, worked into every visible seam around the wheel lock with a rag. Danny tore from an old shirt, then left to sit while the three of them ate the last of the crackers they'd packed for the trip, sitting on overturned buckets in the cottage's collapsed doorway. Caleb explained, mostly to keep his hands busy talking while his mind worked the problem, that rust seized metal because oxidation swelled the iron and locked the threads together, and that penetrating oil worked by capillary action, wicking into gaps too small to see and breaking the bond one molecule at a time. Theo asked where he'd learned that. Caleb said their father had explained it to him once while freeing a stuck bolt on the old truck's undercarriage, years back, in a driveway that didn't exist anymore, and none of them said anything else about it for a while. When enough time had passed, Caleb set the pry bar's claw end against one spoke of the wheel, and Danny braced his shoulder against the doorframe, and together they leaned into it, breath held, muscles straining against metal that had not moved in longer than any of them had been alive. Nothing happened at first except a low groan of protest deep in the mechanism, more felt through the bar than heard. Caleb repositioned, found a better angle, and called for Theo to add his weight to the bar as well. All three brothers now pressed into a single motion, boots braced against the granite threshold, breath coming out in short, controlled bursts, the way their father used to breathe when he was fighting a stubborn joint. The wheel gave a fraction of an inch, then stopped again, and Caleb swore under his breath, wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his wrist, and told them to reset. It took 4 more tries and a second application of oil before the wheel gave for real, turning with a shriek of metal on metal that sent a pair of nesting gulls scattering off the gallery railing above them. Once it started moving, it kept moving, faster than expected, the accumulated resistance of decades breaking all at once, and Caleb nearly lost his footing as the wheel spun free in his hands. Danny let out a short laugh, more relief than joy, and Theo pressed both palms flat against the iron door as if he could feel whatever waited on the other side through the metal itself. Caleb told them both to step back, an old habit from job sites where you never stood in the path of something you'd just freed, and he pulled the door open himself, hinges screaming in protest, sand and grit sifting down from somewhere above. The smell hit them first, cold stone and salt and something faintly metallic, the particular scent of a space that had been sealed away from weather and light for a very long time. Beyond the door, a narrow spiral stair wound upward into darkness, cast iron steps bolted to the tower's inner wall, a handrail worn smooth in places that suggested hands had gripped it more recently than the exterior neglect implied. Caleb pulled a small flashlight from his duffel, the same one he'd carried through every shelter and church parking lot of the last year, and swept the beam upward, catching glimpses of whitewashed stone walls and, higher still, a faint gray light filtering down from somewhere near the top. Danny asked how many steps. Caleb said it didn't matter, and started climbing before either of his brothers could talk him out of going first. The stairs groaned under his weight, but held, each step ringing faintly with the particular hollow sound of old iron. And Caleb counted them without meaning to the way he counted rafters on a framing job, a habit that kept his hands and mind occupied when his nerves wanted otherwise. Halfway up, the flashlight beam caught a landing, a small iron door set into the wall marked with a faded stencil reading, "Watch Room," its own separate lock hanging open and unlatched, as if someone had passed through recently and simply not bothered to secure it again. Caleb paused there, breath fogging faintly in the cold stone air, and looked back down the stairwell at his brothers' faces turned up toward him, pale in the dark. He did not open the watchroom door yet. There would be time for every door in this tower, and something in the stillness of the place told him to take them one at a time, the way his father had taught him to take apart anything worth understanding, piece by careful piece, rather than tearing into it all at once. He climbed the rest of the way to the top alone, the spiral tightening as it rose, until the stairs gave way to a small square landing beneath the lantern room itself, where the last of the afternoon light poured through that one impossibly clean pane of glass they had spotted from the ground. Caleb stood there a long moment, catching his breath, looking out through glass that had clearly been wiped clear by human hands within recent memory, at a view of gray ocean stretching to a horizon he could not name. Somewhere below him, he heard Danny and Theo starting up the stairs at last, their voices carrying up the iron shaft in fragments. And Caleb allowed himself, for the first time since the letter had arrived at the shelter, something close to hope. Small and unfamiliar and not yet trusted, sitting quiet in his chest like a held breath. He wasn't ready to let go. Caleb came back down the spiral stair slower than he'd gone up, one hand trailing the worn iron rail, his mind still caught on the sight of that single, clean pane of glass and the gray ocean beyond it. Danny and Theo met him on the landing outside the watchroom, both of them talking at once about the sound their boots made on the iron steps, the cold that seemed to live permanently inside the tower walls, regardless of the warm afternoon outside. Caleb told them what he'd seen at the top, the lantern room mostly empty, the one clear window. Nothing else remarkable that he could find in the failing light. He did not open the watchroom door. It could wait, he said again. And something in his voice made both brothers agree without argument, though Theo glanced back at the small stenciled sign as they passed it on their way down. They emerged from the iron doorway into late afternoon sun that felt almost violent after the tower's cold gray interior, and it took a moment for Caleb's eyes to adjust enough to notice the man standing near the fallen section of fence at the edge of the property. He was older, maybe 70, built solid through the shoulders in the way of men who had worked with their hands their whole lives, wearing a canvas jacket gone soft with age and a cap with a faded emblem Caleb couldn't quite place from that distance. He didn't call out or wave. He simply stood there, hands in his pockets, watching the three brothers step out of the tower's iron door, like he'd been expecting exactly this and had simply been waiting for it to happen on its own schedule. Caleb approached first, the way he approached anything unfamiliar, cautious but not unfriendly. And the man introduced himself before Caleb could ask. His name was Warren Doyle, and he'd served 31 years with the Coast Guard before retiring to a house 4 miles up the coast road, close enough to keep half an eye on the old station, out of habit more than obligation. He said he'd known Elias Hartley for going on 40 years, ever since Elias had been posted here as the last civilian keeper before the light was automated and then decommissioned altogether. Danny asked how he'd known they would be here. Warren said he hadn't known for certain, but that word traveled fast in a county this size, and Marjorie Pruitt had mentioned at the diner that morning that some Hartley boys had come asking after the old Lighthouse file. They talked for a while standing there in the sand, Warren asking easy questions about where they'd come from and how the drive out had gone. Caleb answering carefully, still working out how much a stranger deserved to know about a family that had spent the last year without an address. Warren didn't press. He seemed content to let the conversation move at its own pace, the way a man does when he's spent 3 decades on ships where patience wasn't optional. When Theo mentioned the frozen wheel lock and how long it had taken to break it free, Warren nodded like he'd expected that too, and said Elias had rigged it himself back in the 90s after a break-in, welded reinforcement into the mechanism that made it stiffer than a factory lock had any right to be. He walked with them back toward the cottage, pointing out details along the way that none of the brothers would have noticed on their own. A drainage channel Elias had cut by hand to keep the foundation from flooding, a section of roof shingled with a slightly different color that marked a repair from some storm years back. Warren said Elias had kept coming out here long after the county condemned the place, walking the same quarter-mile dirt track on foot most weeks, sometimes twice, carrying a toolbox that never seemed to get any lighter no matter how many years passed. Nobody in town had ever quite understood why. Warren said he'd asked Elias about it once, directly, and the old man had only said that some promises didn't come with an expiration date, and changed the subject before Warren could ask what he meant by it. Back at his truck, an old Ford with rust patterns that mirrored the tower's own iron railings almost exactly, Warren pulled out a battered toolbox from the bed and set it down in the sand without ceremony. Inside were things the brothers didn't have and badly needed: a socket set with a 3/8-inch drive, a headlamp with a working battery, a coil of stiff rope, a box of assorted lag screws and washers. Caleb tried to ask what he owed for it, reaching for the $6 still folded in his jacket pocket, and Warren waved the offer away before Caleb finished the sentence. He said the tools had been sitting in his garage doing nobody any good, and that Elias Hartley had lent him a hand more times than he could count over the years without ever once mentioning repayment. So the least Warren could do was pass a little of that along to the man's own kin. He told them he'd come back out in a few days, once they'd had time to look the place over properly, and that he knew a man in town who did structural inspections cheap if the roofline turned out to need more than patching. Danny asked, almost hesitant, why a stranger would drive out here twice in 1 week for people he'd never met before today. Warren considered the question longer than it seemed to deserve, looking up at the tower rather than at either brother, and said that a man learns things about people from the company they kept, and Elias Hartley had kept good company for a long time out here, quietly, without asking anyone to notice. He didn't say yes to helping them further. He didn't say no either. He just climbed back into his truck, started the engine, and told them through the rolled-down window that he'd see them Thursday, before pulling away down the rutted dirt track and leaving the three brothers alone again, with the tower, the toolbox, and the first real evidence that their great-uncle had spent his final years being something in this small, forgotten place that none of them had ever gotten the chance to know him as. They spent Thursday morning waiting on Warren Doyle's promised return, using the hours to clear the cottage's front room of 2 decades of dust and fallen plaster, stacking broken furniture in the yard for a burn pile none of them had matches for yet. Danny found a rhythm in the work that Caleb hadn't seen in his younger brother in a long while, sweeping debris out the door with a length of scrap plywood turned into an improvised shovel, humming something tuneless under his breath. Theo worked the windows, prying loose the swollen plywood boards one at a time, with the claw end of a hammer Warren had left behind, letting daylight into rooms that hadn't seen it in years. By noon, the cottage smelled less like mildew and more like salt air, and Caleb allowed himself a moment to stand in the doorway and simply look at what they'd already changed with 4 hands and half a day. Warren arrived a little after 1, true to his word, with a second man in tow he introduced as Pete Ferrante, a retired structural inspector who owed Warren a favor from some story involving a flooded basement that nobody bothered to explain in full. Pete walked the cottage and the tower's exterior with a level and a moisture meter, muttering measurements to himself, and pronounced the granite base sound enough, the roof needing work but not urgent, and the whole structure, in his professional opinion, worth considerably more trouble than the county's condemnation notice suggested. He left without asking for payment, same as Warren had, saying only that he'd write up a proper report if the boys ever needed one for insurance purposes, and that Elias Hartley used to bring him coffee on cold mornings, back when Pete still worked full jobs out this way. It was Warren who suggested, almost as an afterthought while packing his tools back into the truck bed, that they take a proper look at the watchroom landing halfway up the tower, since Elias had used that space as his working office in the later years, rather than the lantern room itself. Caleb had nearly forgotten about the stenciled door he'd passed twice now without opening. The 4 of them climbed together this time, boots ringing on iron steps, Warren moving slower than the boys but steady. One hand always on the rail out of a habit 31 years in the Coast Guard had clearly never let him shake. At the landing, Caleb pushed the unlatched door open, and it swung inward without resistance, hinges oiled far more recently than anything else in the tower had any right to be. The watchroom was small, maybe 8 feet across, lined with a built-in desk and shelving that looked handmade, dovetail joints at every corner instead of nails. The kind of joinery a man only bothers with when he expects the work to outlast him. A single chair sat pushed in at the desk, and above it, mounted to the wall, a barometer and a tide chart, both still legible under a film of dust. Danny ran a hand along the desk's edge and said it looked less like storage and more like somebody's second home. Warren agreed, quietly, and said Elias had spent more nights up here in his last decade than he had down in the cottage, though nobody had ever pressed him on why. It was Theo who found the seam in the back wall, tucked behind a section of shelving he'd shifted aside to look for spiders, a nearly invisible line in the whitewashed brick that didn't match the mortar pattern of the rest of the room. Caleb ran his thumb along it and felt what the eye had missed. A section of wall no more than 3 feet wide that had been bricked in separately, the mortar slightly paler, the joints slightly less weathered than everything surrounding it. Warren stepped closer, studied it for a long moment, and said he'd never known this wall was anything but solid in all the years he'd stood in this room drinking coffee with Elias. Caleb felt something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with exertion. Before going further, Caleb wants to say something directly, because if this story has held your attention this far, subscribing costs nothing and helps keep stories like the Hartley brothers being told. Now, back to the wall Elias Hartley had built with his own hands and told no one about. Breaking through took the better part of an hour, working carefully with a masonry chisel Warren produced from somewhere in his truck, tapping rather than swinging, mindful of the load-bearing wall just beyond the false section. The bricks came away one at a time, revealing a shallow, recessed cavity no more than 2 feet deep, built into what had originally been a service niche for old wiring conduit. Inside sat a metal strongbox, military green, its surface dulled but not rusted, protected all these years from the salt air by the brick seal around it. Beside the strongbox, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff with age, sat a second, smaller bundle, and beneath both, a stack of leather-bound ledgers stacked neat as anything Caleb had ever seen on a job site. Caleb lifted the strongbox out himself, surprised by its weight, and set it on the handmade desk under the watchroom's single window. It wasn't locked, or rather the lock had rusted open at some point and simply held shut by the box's own weight and the swell of humidity over the years. Inside, beneath a folded wool blanket meant to cushion whatever lay beneath it, sat bundled cash, banded in stacks that Caleb didn't count in that first moment because counting felt beside the point, and a sealed envelope with his father's name written across the front in a careful, old-fashioned hand. Danny made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Theo simply stared. Warren, standing back near the door to give the brothers room, said nothing at all, though his jaw worked once, like a man swallowing something he'd been holding on to for a long time. Caleb didn't open the envelope right away. He set it down carefully on the desk beside the strongbox, next to the stacked ledgers whose covers, he noticed now, were labeled by year in the same careful hand, going back decades. Whatever this was, it wasn't a single secret meant to be understood in a rush. It was a life's worth of something, sealed behind brick and waiting, and Caleb found himself thinking of his father's old rule about a man being worth his last full day of work, wondering for the first time in over a year whether that rule had ever really belonged only to Wendell Hartley, or whether it had come down from somewhere further back, from a man who'd spent 40 years keeping a promise nobody had asked him to keep. Warren left them alone that evening, saying only that some things were better read without an audience, and that he'd come back around noon the next day to see how they'd gotten on. He took Pete Ferrante with him, and the sound of his truck engine faded down the dirt track until the property fell into the particular quiet of a place with no electricity and no neighbors, just wind moving through beach grass and the distant, steady rhythm of waves against the rocks below the point. Caleb carried the strongbox and the sealed envelope up the last flight of stairs to the lantern room, choosing it deliberately over the watchroom. wanting to read whatever waited in the last place his great-uncle had likely stood before he died. Danny and Theo followed without being asked, and the three of them settled onto the floor of the lantern room as the sun dropped low over the water, casting long orange light through that one clean pane of glass. Caleb turned the envelope over twice before opening it, running his thumb along the wax seal that had cracked with age but never fully given way. Inside were several pages, folded in thirds, the paper gone soft and slightly yellowed, but the ink still dark, written in the same careful hand from the ledger covers. He unfolded them slowly, aware of his brothers watching, aware that whatever this letter said would be the closest any of them ever came to, knowing the man who had kept this tower standing for reasons none of them yet understood. He cleared his throat once and began to read aloud, his voice steadier than he expected it to be. To Wendell's boys, whoever you turn out to be. The letter began, "I never had children of my own, and I never met you, which I understand is a strange way to start something meant for family. I knew your father when he was young, before the two of us stopped speaking, the way brothers sometimes do, over things that seemed important at the time, and stopped mattering long before either of us died. I am writing this in September of 2019, sitting in the lantern room of a lighthouse the county tells me is condemned, though it has never once felt that way to me. I imagine by the time you read this, I will be gone, and this tower will have passed to you the way the county requires such things to pass on paper through lawyers, without anyone ever explaining why it mattered to me the way it did. I came to Gull Point in 1968, 19 years old, and running from a family that had no patience for a boy who preferred machines and tide charts to whatever future they'd planned for him. The Coast Guard gave me this light to keep, and I kept it for 11 years before automation made keepers unnecessary. And when they told me to leave, I found I could not do it. I bought the parcel outright in 1981 with money I'd saved from every paycheck I never spent on anything else, because leaving this place felt less like moving on and more like abandoning a post, and I had spent too many years being the kind of man who did not abandon posts. What I have not told anyone in this town, not Warren, not Pete, not the county clerks who've handled my paperwork over the years, is what I did with the years after the light went dark. I kept fixing things. Not this tower alone, though I did that too, but other things, other people's things, in ways I never let anyone trace back to me. A widow's roof 3 towns over, patched the winter after her husband died, paid for in cash, left in an envelope on her porch with no name attached. A young man's fishing boat, engine rebuilt free of charge one autumn when the fleet was struggling, delivered back to the dock overnight with a note that said only that someone believed in him. I did this for 40 years, Wendell's boys, quietly, because I had more than I needed, and because somewhere along the way I decided that a man's worth wasn't measured by what he kept for himself. The ledgers in the watch room record all of it, every dollar, every name, though I never told a soul who received what or why. And I ask that you keep that discretion if you choose to continue any part of what I started. The money in the strongbox is what remains, $61,400, saved slowly across 4 decades from a keeper's pension and a life that never required much of anything beyond tools, tide charts, and this tower. It is not a fortune by the standards of men who measure such things in fortunes. It is, I hope, enough to give 3 young men I never had the chance to know a foundation steadier than the one I understand your father left you, through no real fault of his own, beyond the particular hardness of the years he lived through. I do not know your names. I do not know your faces. I know only that you carry the same blood that carried me through 11 years on this rock and 40 more refusing to leave it. And I trust that whatever kind of men you have become, you have inherited at least a portion of the stubbornness that runs through every Hartley I have ever known, myself included. Use this place if it suits you. Sell it if it does not. But if you keep it, keep the light the way I kept it, not because anyone asked you to, but because some things are worth tending simply for their own sake, long after anyone is watching or keeping score. I am sorry I never called. I am sorry for a great many things I have no room left on this page to explain. Signed, Elias Hartley, September 14th, 2019. Caleb finished reading and let the last page settle in his lap. The lantern room gone quiet except for wind pressing gently against the glass and the distant hush of the tide below. Danny wiped his face once with the back of his hand and said nothing. Theo sat very still, knees drawn up to his chest, staring out at the darkening water without blinking. Caleb folded the letter back along its original creases, careful with it the way he'd been careful with his father's tape measure through every hard mile of the last year, and slid it back into its envelope. None of them spoke for a long while after that, sitting together in the fading light at the top of a tower that a stranger had spent 40 years refusing to abandon, for reasons that had, in the end, turned out to belong to all three of them. The man arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in a sedan, too clean for the dirt track it had just come down, parking well short of the fence and walking the rest of the way as though reluctant to let the gravel touch his shoes. Caleb was on the roof when he saw the car, replacing shingles Pete Ferrante had flagged weeks earlier, and he climbed down slowly, wiping his hands on a rag before crossing the yard to meet the stranger. The man introduced himself as Roland Spears, representing a coastal shipping and logistics firm out of the county seat, and he had a business card ready before Caleb had finished saying his own name. He was maybe 50, dressed for an office rather than a beach, and he spoke in the unhurried, practiced tone of a man who had delivered the same pitch many times before to many different families. Spears explained, walking a slow circle around the base of the tower as he talked, that his company had long held an interest in the Gull Point parcel for reasons related to a proposed private dock expansion 2 coves over, and that the Lighthouse's position controlled a right-of-way easement his firm's engineers considered essential. He offered $9,000 for the property, cash closing within 30 days, and framed it as a kindness to 3 young men who, as he put it, likely had better uses for their time than restoring a 100-year-old ruin with no plumbing and no road to speak of. Caleb said he'd need to think about it. Spears smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes, and said he understood completely, though he mentioned, almost as an afterthought while folding himself back into his sedan, that easement disputes could get complicated in county court, and that it would be a shame for young men in the Hartleys' position to spend money they didn't have fighting a case they were unlikely to win. He came back twice more over the following 2 weeks, each time raising the offer slightly, each time delivering his soft warnings about legal complications with the same unhurried courtesy, never raising his voice, never quite making a threat he could be held to later. Danny wanted to tell him to leave and not come back. Theo thought they should at least hear the man out properly. Worried in the quiet way he worried about most things, that they might be standing between a real fortune and a legal fight none of them could afford to lose. Caleb split the difference, telling Spears each time that the answer was still no, and using the hours between visits to drive into Hollis Bay and sit across a desk from the same probate attorney who had sent the original letter, a careful, unhurried woman named Ruth Okonkwo, who read through the county's easement claims twice before telling Caleb, plainly, that the right-of-way Spears kept referencing didn't appear anywhere in the actual recorded deed. Ruth filed the paperwork to formally clear title on the Hartleys' behalf, a process that took the better part of a month and cost more in fees than the brothers had ever held in a bank account at one time, though the strongbox made covering it possible in a way that would have been unthinkable a season earlier. She also flagged, almost as a courtesy, that Spears' firm had attempted similar acquisitions on 2 other coastal parcels in the past decade, both times targeting elderly or absentee owners, both times abandoning the pursuit the moment a lawyer got involved and started asking for documentation. Caleb relayed this to Warren over coffee one morning at the cottage, now fitted with a second-hand propane stove and a table Danny had built from salvaged dock lumber, and Warren nodded slowly, unsurprised, saying Elias had mentioned a man matching Spears's description, sniffing around the property years earlier, before deciding it wasn't worth the trouble of chasing off. It was during this same stretch of weeks that a young man named Marcus Webb showed up at the property on foot, having walked the last 4 miles from the county road after his car broke down near the highway with nowhere else to go and no money for a tow. He was 19, thin in the way people get thin from skipping meals rather than choice, and he'd heard from a cousin of Dale's at the bait shop that the Hartley place sometimes had work for someone willing to do it. Caleb recognized something in the boy's posture before Marcus said a single word about his situation, the particular way he held his shoulders, like he was bracing for a door to close in his face. He offered Marcus a meal before asking a single question about his circumstances, and Danny, without needing to be told, pulled out the cot they kept folded behind the cottage's back room. Marcus stayed on to help finish the roof and clear the last of the fallen fencing, paid a fair wage out of the strongbox funds without ceremony or explanation. And it was Theo who eventually asked him, over dinner one evening, where he'd been sleeping before he walked out to Gull Point. Marcus admitted, quietly, that it had been a shelter 2 towns over, and then a bus station, and then nowhere in particular for the better part of a week. Caleb didn't say much in response, only that he understood, and something in the way he said it made clear he meant it in a way that required no further explanation. Danny gave Marcus his own old jacket without being asked, the sleeves too long, and told him to keep it. Nobody made a show of any of it. It simply happened, quietly, the way kindness had apparently always happened around this particular stretch of coastline, long before any of the Hartley brothers arrived to learn the pattern. Spears made one final visit near the end of that month, arriving to find the roof finished, a new mailbox set at the head of the drive, and 4 young men instead of 3 working the property with a purpose that had clearly hardened since his first visit. Ruth Okonkwo had by then sent his firm a formal letter disputing any claim to easement rights, backed by a clean title and a deed with no ambiguity left in it for a company to exploit. Spears stood by his sedan a long moment, looking up at the tower with an expression Caleb couldn't quite read, somewhere between irritation and something almost like respect for a fight he clearly hadn't expected to lose. He said finally that he wouldn't be back, wished them luck with the property in a tone that suggested he meant it despite everything, and drove off down the dirt track for the last time, leaving nothing behind him but settling dust and a silence that felt, for the first time since the letter had arrived at the shelter months earlier, entirely their own. Word of the dispute with Spears's firm had made its way around Hollis Bay faster than Caleb expected, carried mostly by Dale at the bait shop and by Marjorie Pruitt at the courthouse, both of whom seemed to take a quiet satisfaction in how the matter had resolved. What surprised Caleb more was how many people in town turned out to have their own version of a story about Elias Hartley, small kindnesses surfacing now that the old man's name was being spoken aloud again after years of near silence. A woman named Pat Delgado stopped by the cottage one afternoon to say Elias had paid for her son's dental surgery in 2011, an envelope of cash left with the school nurse and never explained. A retired fisherman named Ollie Marsh mentioned, almost in passing, that his boat engine had been rebuilt for free one October, when the whole fleet was struggling, exactly as the letter had described, though Ollie had never known who to thank. Caleb began cross-referencing these stories against the ledgers from the watchroom, not to verify them exactly, but because he found himself wanting to understand the full shape of what his great-uncle had done, year by year, name by name, written in that same careful hand, across 4 decades of entries. The ledgers held no editorializing, no explanations, just dates and amounts and initials that Caleb slowly matched to faces around town as people continued to come forward. A roof here, a hospital bill there, a widow's heating oil paid through 3 consecutive winters without her ever knowing the source. By the time Caleb closed the last ledger, he had counted contributions to no fewer than 31 families across 4 decades. And he understood, finally, why a man would shut off his own water and electricity while continuing to visit a condemned lighthouse several times a week for the rest of his life. The town held a small gathering at the end of that summer, organized loosely by Warren and Pat Delgado, more potluck than ceremony. Folding tables set up in the sand near the base of the tower, and strings of borrowed lights run off a generator Dale contributed for the evening. People brought dishes and stories in roughly equal measure, and Caleb found himself standing near the fence for a long while just listening. Danny beside him, working through a plate of someone's fried clams. Theo further off talking with Marcus Webb about a community college 2 towns over that had a carpentry program worth looking into. Warren gave a short, unpolished toast that mentioned Elias by name only once, said the man had never wanted thanks and probably wouldn't have shown up to an event exactly like this one, and everybody laughed in a way that felt more like grief settling than humor landing. Spears's firm never returned, and Ruth Okonkwo confirmed by early autumn that the title was fully clear, the lien satisfied. The deed recorded under all 3 Hartley brothers' names, without a single easement clause anywhere in the paperwork. The $61,400 in the strongbox had gone toward the roof, the plumbing, a used truck to replace the one they'd lost the year before, and a modest fund Caleb set aside without telling his brothers at first, meant to cover whatever came next for whoever needed it the way Elias's money once had. Danny found steady framing work with a contractor out of Hollis Bay, who remembered Wendell Hartley fondly and was glad to put a second Hartley on the payroll. Theo enrolled in that carpentry program in October, riding into town 3 mornings a week in the new truck, paperback traded for a textbook that he actually finished. Marcus Webb stayed on through the winter, earning his keep and then some, learning the trade alongside Danny on small jobs around the county, sleeping in the cottage's back room that had once held nothing but broken furniture and dust. Caleb never made a formal offer of the arrangement. It simply continued, the way things at Gull Point seemed to continue once they started. One season folding into the next without anyone announcing the shift. By the following spring, Marcus had saved enough to put down on a used car of his own, and he left the way people eventually do, gratefully, promising to visit. And Caleb told him the door stayed open whenever he needed it. The same words Warren had never quite said to them, but had meant all along. The lantern room took the better part of a year to properly restore. Glass replaced pane by pane. The old lamp mechanism cleaned and rewired by a specialist Warren tracked down through a Coast Guard contact 2 states over. It was Warren who suggested, once the light was functional again, that they apply through the county for a decorative exemption to relight it, not as a working navigation aid but as a private beacon, purely for whoever might need to see it from the water. The county approved the request with unusual speed. Marjorie Pruitt, later admitting she'd pushed the paperwork through herself, out of a fondness for the story that had grown around the Hartley name that year. On the evening they finally switched the light on for the first time in over a decade. Caleb, Danny, and Theo climbed the tower together and stood in the lantern room, watching the beams sweep out across darkening water, none of them saying much of anything, all 3 remembering, in their own private way, a year that had started with $9 and a shelter cot too small for 3 brothers. That same evening, walking back down from the tower as the light swept overhead in slow, steady rotations, Caleb noticed a figure standing near the fallen fence at the edge of the property. A young woman with a backpack and the particular stillness of someone unsure whether she was welcome. He recognized the posture immediately, the same bracing he'd once carried himself, the same practiced readiness for a door about to close. He didn't ask her story before offering a plate from the dinner Danny had just finished cooking, the same way a meal had once been offered to him without conditions attached. She said her name was Grace, and that she'd walked the last few miles after her ride left her at the county road, and that she'd heard from someone in town that this was a place that sometimes had work for people willing to do it. Caleb told her to come inside and warm up first, and the rest could wait until morning. Behind them, the lighthouse beam continued its slow sweep across the water. The same light that had once guided ships, and now guided nothing in particular, except whoever happened to need guiding. And somewhere out past the dark tree line, a screen door creaked shut against the evening chill, sealing in the warmth of a kitchen that had once stood empty for years. A promise, Caleb had come to understand, was not a thing you kept once and finished. It was a light you left on, faithfully, for whoever might still be finding their way home.